My name's Sean Griffin. Thanks very much for coming to the first event of the Leftist Law Society. It's good to see so many people here. We didn't expect this. It's good to see there's more than just me, Martin and Paul, as a relief. Just to tell you a bit about the society was the idea of a group of students in response to what was perceived to be an apathy to student activism and politics generally within the School of Law. Clearly we've been proved wrong, obviously, with respect to the apathy, as so many of you have turned up tonight. But what I feel was needed as a focal point to bring people together to raise awareness and coordinate action. The solution to this we came up with was a society which provides a forum for discussion of legal issues and current affairs, and a network for organising campaigns. Although the society was initiated by law students in the law school, we want to make clear that the society is open to all, like whoever you are, including practitioners, academics and students from other disciplines. In this way we hope to rid the law and the legal profession of its image as an elitist and exclusive closed shop. To quote from our mission statement, the society seeks to remind their country's fledgling lawyers and all those who are prepared to listen that the true aims of the law are justice, equality of treatment for all, and the protection of the vulnerable. The law and their lawyers can be vehicles for good in society, and our society wishes to promote this guiding principle in the legal profession of Scotland and beyond. The society will be holding a series of events this semester and next, where guest speakers will come along and give a lecture on a topic of their choosing. We hope that this offers something not available in the current LLB programme of contract property and commercial law. Our first speaker here with us tonight is human rights lawyer extraordinaire Aamer Anwar. He needs no introduction, so I'll hand it over to him. There'll be a few words. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Sean. I'm actually glad I made it. If this is apathy, this is great apathy in terms of the number of people that turned out. Some of you might have seen involved in the Sheridan trial that started yesterday, and some of the students coming in had asked about whether I was going to be speaking about it. Unfortunately, because it's a live trial, there's not very much I can say, but if you're able to watch the Dispatches programme, get that on back copy, whether that was on last night, or want to read about stuff that the News of the World get up to, then that in itself should explain it. But I want to start off by saying that, talking on a general basis, I was asked about what sort of theme, and it was on my life as a radical lawyer, but I really want to expand. It's not often you get a chance to speak as long as you want, because I was asked today, which is a dangerous thing to say to a lawyer. Normally I get told I've got 5 minutes or 10 minutes and people tell you to shut up. But starting off, I think, with the word Tony Blair, in October 2005, he declared that the rules of the game had changed, and a month later you had the House of Commons voting through an extension of the time that suspects could be held without trial in this country, and it went from 14 days to 28 days, and Tony Blair actually wanted 90 days. And I think it's wonderful how all of the cabinet all talk about New Labour is gone and how they're all against the war in Iraq, and how they wanted things to change and they lost the battleground for liberty to the Tory party. But incidentally, every single one of them, practically, with a few honourable exceptions, actually voted for bits and parts of this legislation and extension of the time limits. And what the government, and disgracefully a Labour government at the time, wanted was indefinite detention, and equated in the public memory for a lot of people, perhaps not people, I see mostly young faces in this room, but some of the older ones will remember what indefinite detention is, and the word internment is still equated in the public memory with the injustice of mass internment in Northern Ireland of the Catholic community, which was more than 30 odd years, 30 to 40 years ago, and it was a disaster. It failed to actually incarcerate IRA activists. The so-called intelligence on which it was based was entirely erroneous, and the burning injustice actually had an effect of both in this country and in Ireland of consolidating support for the armed struggle for more than 3 decades against those who had actually imposed it. And history, and I think it's important because every 20, 30 years we go through this so-called war on terror. We have this phrase bandied about the country by various political leaders of, national security, and we're protecting national security and we're acting in national interest. And I think it is important that, especially whether it be law students or whatever subject is that you're studying, that we do go back to our history books, because often we forget our history. It's important that we ask our parents, our families, actually what happened 20, 30 years ago, because you will find Even, I know when I talked to my parents, I was brought up in Liverpool, about my dad coming here in the 50s and then leaving the country and then coming back in the 60s, the idea of the words would be up around many of the houses or renting places around here of, you know, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs was standard, but it is important to remember actually what that led to in terms of the injustices perpetrated in this country, but also in Ireland. And history is an important issue in that it shows that injustice becomes a rallying point for extremists and for the terror recruits. And what we see today and what we've seen over the last decade is legal assault after legal assault being backed up by public spectacles to create a climate of fear and suspicion within this country. And it's within this background that some of us have a difficult job as lawyers who believe in justice actually have to step into to put our heads above the parapet, and quite often it is an extremely lonely existence. The war on terror has actually meant that the word human rights, I noticed Sean introduced me as a human rights lawyer, and that's often the tag that we get in the newspapers or in the media, human rights lawyer, and it's often used as sort of a dirty word by the right-wing media, by the tabloids, or controversial human rights lawyer. I'm actually a criminal defence lawyer. And the word human rights is something that I see is ingrained as part of the work that I do on a daily basis, whether it happens to be criminal law, whether it happens to be immigration, whatever aspect of law it is, human rights should be incorporated into all of that, because the Human Rights Act has been incorporated into the legislation within this country. It's supposed to impact on every area of our life, but unfortunately it actually doesn't. So when you actually raise the word human rights, you either get the system saying, well, you know, we've had human rights in this country for years, we'll tell that to the Birmingham Six. Tell that to Guildford 4, tell that to Mohammed Akhtar Sadiq, tell that to Thomas Campbell, T.C. Campbell, who was convicted for spent 16 years of his life behind bars for a murder he didn't commit of the 6 members of the Dole family. And those of us who actually fight for our clients in the last decade, especially on this issue, and our focus starts off on the word terrorism, clients accused of terrorism, those of us who fight for our clients are accused of being terror sympathisers. And it's often very difficult to mention that uppermost in lawyers' minds or in the justice system should be the rule of law, especially in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, especially when the 9/11 anniversary is approaching, or 7/7 approaches, or when Glasgow Airport attack approaches and people say, well, better shoot first, you know, then ask questions later. I don't agree with that, because I think it gives substance to the terror recruiters. It allows them to say a section of the community is being targeted, and it very much takes us back to 30 years ago in exactly the same way that the Irish community was treated in this country. In the last decade, we've seen operation after operation involving hundreds of police where they charge into houses. Usually these are supposed to be secret intelligence operations, and I've always found it amusing going back to, I think it was 2003, just before the Iraq war started, where we had an operation where 7 Algerians in Scotland were arrested up and down through the country, and there was this massive operation and hundreds of police officers involved in helicopters and gunmen and all the rest of it. But you always get the men in the white suits turning up at the same time, but you always get the TV cameras somehow on a secret intelligence operation. If it's secret and if it's intelligence, how do the camera crews get there alongside with the police? And often the word intelligence is used, and quite honestly, when the word intelligence, and I remember in the Algerian case, 7 men were dragged out of their beds, taken away from their workplaces, taken away from their families. These 7 were asylum seekers from Algeria, and everybody in the whole legal system, including many of the lawyers that are involved in representation, people talking to each other, people in my office saying, well, they must have done it, you know, 7 of them. They couldn't have got it wrong. It was the first big terrorism case in Scotland. They must be up to no good. There was all this stuff that was printed in the national media about they're going to bomb the Hogmanay celebrations. These are Algerian terrorists, they're part of Al-Qaeda, etc., and all this sort of stuff. Very quickly, people, the only ones that, in terms of breaking it up when we were talking to people with Irish background, was like, well, this is what they said about the Birmingham Six. This is what they said about the Guildford 4. They must be guilty. The Birmingham pub bombings happened, dragging Paddy Hill, dragging the rest of them. They must be guilty. They must have done it. And even if they didn't do it, then, you know, they must have got up to something no good. Eventually, what happened within that case was something like 3 months later, we went to court. They were released on bail, and the bail conditions that the Crown released them upon was bail on standard conditions, which, quite honestly, is bail on standard conditions is the standard conditions you get if you're a shoplifter. We knew right at that point in time that these men were innocent, because if the Crown had even considered one iota that these men were capable of going out and inflicting major damage and murdering innocent people, then they would not have granted or asked for bail on standard conditions. However, They left the proceedings live in order that the press could not print the fact that the men were released on bail. They left it live and kept it going right up until a few days before Christmas. Eventually we got facts through at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a couple of days before Christmas, which said no further proceedings. End of story. No massive fanfare of media greeted the release or the fact that there was no further prosecutions, that these men were given a carte blanche of that they were innocent, that they weren't planning any attacks. But what followed then was the asylum system, because these men were asylum seekers, being told by the Home Office, well, we're going to deport you now. Several of them were to be facing deportation. And what we said in our context was that when we had to fight vigorous campaigns and massive campaigns up and down the country, were that if these men were sent back to Algeria, then at best they faced torture and imprisonment, at worst they faced an execution squad. And what I know is that a number of individuals and Algerians that were sent back as a result of these several hundred arrests that took place up and down the country, some of them have disappeared. Their families are unwilling to speak out because they know if they're being held in prison, then the family will face torture and they will also disappear. Or at worst, what they've actually seen is an execution squad. And there was very little discussion of that in this country, apart from a couple of years later, where it came to being that the intelligence that this was all based upon was actually not James Bond intelligence, it was more like Austin Powers style intelligence. Because the word ricin was utilised, these men were out to poison the whole country. None of it came to fruition, not a single successful prosecution. And I start off with that because as a socialist and as a campaigner, I believe that, and an anti-war campaigner, I believe that potential targets, whether they're holidaymakers at Glasgow Airport or whether they're clubbers in London, I do not think are the architects of Britain's alliance with George Bush, nor its instruments or its beneficiaries. And like the majority of people within this country, most of the potential victims of the bombs would oppose British presence, I believe, in Iraq, and would want the troops to come home. And attacks on Britain are as unjustifiable in Britain. Attacks in Britain are as unjustifiable in Britain as they are in Iraq or Afghanistan. But often, as lawyers, when we say these terms, and they're very emotive, when people say, "Oh, terrorist sympathisers," that's the usual stock response. Terrorist sympathisers. I see no difference between the casualties imposed by a stealth bomber or by a suicide bomber. It takes innocent life. It's not targeted. And at the end of the day, innocent people suffer. But out of the ashes of those innocent people, what you have are people with absolutely no hope who then do go on to destroy other people's lives. And I do not think this has got us anywhere, because what I know is before the second Iraq war, there was no terrorist bombs in this country. There was no suicide, no Al-Qaeda, there was no people being murdered on the streets of London within this country. But we were told when we went into this war that we were going to a war to defeat terrorism. And at the time, Gordon Brown, Tony Blair argued that the attacks occurred in Iraq irrespective of Iraq. Attacks in this country occurred irrespective of Iraq, irrespective of Afghanistan, and they said that the terrorist threat was about violent extremists who had a grievance against Western society, particularly against the values they represent. But there is one simple fact, as I said, before the war in Iraq, Britain was not under threat from bombings in this country. Now it is. And what Britain needs is not more terror laws, which I suspect once the Tories have finished off